We did the Vietnam War. What's your name? I'm Amir Miller.
Rohshan.
Saul.
When was the Vietnam War? Well, it was from November 1st, 1955 to April 30th, 1975. And actually, it is one of the most longest wars in U.S. history, in case you guys didn't know that. Where was it? Well, the Vietnam War was located, yes, Vietnam. Laos, Vietnam, and some parts of Cambodia. And in the 17th Peril is basically, they split North Vietnam and South Vietnam in half. The north side was communist and the south side was democratic. And for the type of war that they used during Vietnam was guerrilla warfare. And Americans were not used to this type of war style. Basically, guerrilla warfare is the Viet Cong will attack by ambushing, building underground tunnels that would be used to sneak attack the U.S. Army. And the U.S. Army was not prepared for this specific type of fighting style. And that's one of the reasons why we lost the war. Next up, origins by Saul.
Okay. Causes of the Vietnam War trace back to the end of World War II. There was a French colony called Indochina. It was made up of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. It was occupied by Japan during the war. 1941, a Vietnamese nationalist movement, Viet Minh, was formed by Ho Chi Minh. He waged a guerrilla warfare against Japan. Near the end of the war, Japan began to promote Vietnamese nationalism and granted them their independence. Following the defeat of Japan, the French returned to take possession of their colony. Entrance to Vietnam was permitted by the Viet Minh after assurance had been given that the country would gain independence as part of the French Union. In the 1950s, the Donwa theory was in effect. It was a theory that if one country is taken over by expansionists, especially communists, all neighboring party or the like nearby nations will be taken over one after another in the same way. Also back to the French coming back. Discussion broke down between two parties in December 1946. The French shelled the city of Haiphong and forcibly re-entered the capital.
Major events during the Vietnamese War. So from Saul's, we're going to fast forward to 1963, when the South Vietnamese president Ngo Diem is executed in a military coup. And then the following year, 1964, on August 2nd and 4th, was the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and that was when the North Vietnamese attacked two U.S. destroyers that were sitting in international waters. And then August 7th in the same month, in response to that Gulf of Tonkin incident, the U.S. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And then a year later, March 2nd, 1965, a sustained U.S. aerial bombing campaign of North Vietnam began, and that was called Operation Rolling Thunder. The same month, on March 8th, the first U.S. combat troops arrived in Vietnam. And then fast forward into January 30th of 1968, the North Vietnamese joined forces with the Viet Cong to launch the Tet Offensive, and that is considered basically the turning point of the Vietnamese War. And it was on January 31st, again of 1968, and 70,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched the Tet Offensive, which was named after the Lunar New Year, called Tet. And it was a series of coordinated, fierce attacks on more than 100 cities and towns in South Vietnam. General Vo Nguyen Giap, leader of the Communist People's Army in Vietnam, the PAVN, planned the offensive and attempt to both prevent rebellion among the South Vietnamese population and to encourage the United States to scale back its support of the Saigon regime. Though U.S. and South Vietnamese forces managed to hold off the communist attacks, news coverage of the offensive, including the lengthy Battle of Hue, shocked and dismayed the American public and further eroded support for the war effort. Despite heavy casualties, North Vietnam achieved a strategic victory with the Tet Offensive as the attacks marked a turning point in the Vietnam War and the beginning of a slow, painful American withdrawal from the region. I have a video on the Tet Offensive.
Looking for a little more time to discover things you love? Try Google Express. Just choose items from your favorite stores and get them delivered today. Google Express. Your favorite stores delivered today.
It was shocking because here suddenly is a coordinated attack against every provincial capital in Vietnam.
And the hospital where I was took the first rounds of jet. And when I say rounds, I mean rockets, mortar, you name it, we took it.
Now 126 cities get attacked. All these places getting hit at exactly the same time. You could hear it. It was like a wave of going from the land to the sea.
The city of Hue was almost totally in the hands of the enemy, and it would take probably a month or more for the Marines to retake it, and at terrific casualties because they were fighting house to house, room to room in a city environment. Urban warfare is really brutal, really vicious, and very costly in terms of casualties.
Some people think, oh, it was the Tet Offensive, and then after that it stopped. That year, 1968, more than 15,000 Americans were killed. 15,000 in 1 year, for goodness sakes.
As I circled to see myself as I came over the outskirts of the city, I was aware that something was going on. Something big was happening. Because the people in the streets who had been killed, vehicles had pulled off into the sides of the roads into like ditches, and people were barricaded on the roofs of the houses. I was able to see the assault onto the American embassy by helicopters from a distance.
you had the spectacle of the Viet Cong commandos penetrating Saigon and into the American embassy grounds, the very belly of the beast in their view, and they were there. It was a shock. It was a shock to America that they were able to do this. And there are those who say, well, but we won Tet. We killed all these people eventually. But that's not how the Vietnamese saw it. Sensitized the American public to the fact this war was not necessarily going the way that the commanders and the politicians said it was going.
And if that wasn't bad enough, a few months later, also in 1968, the My Lai massacre took place, and that and the Tet Offensive were some of the most brutal things that the U.S. Citizens caught wind of. And the My Lai massacre happened in 1968 in March, but the American public didn't learn of the massacre really until 1969 in November, so it was a while. And what the massacre was a mass killing of 350 to 500 unarmed civilians in South Vietnam. And this was committed by United States Army soldiers. And the victims included men, women, children, and infants. And many of the women were gang raped and their bodies were mutilated. And many of the soldiers faced lawsuits, but only Lieutenant William Calley Jr., a platoon leader, was convicted. And he was found guilty of killing 22 villagers. And he was originally sentenced to life, but he only served 3.5 years on house arrest. So it was pretty terrible. And then in 1969, in July, Nixon ordered many of the U.S. troops withdraw from Vietnam. And then in the same year, 1969, in September, Ho Chi Minh, the communist revolutionary leader, he died at age 79. And then also in 1970, Nixon announced that the U.S. troops will attack enemy locations in Cambodia. And news sparks nationwide protests, especially on college campuses. Fast forward to 1973, the Paris Peace Accords are signed that provide a ceasefire, and a few months later, the last U.S. troops are withdrawn from Vietnam, and that ended the U.S. involvement. But after that, in 1975, the South Vietnam surrendered to the communists, and Vietnam, the year later, was unified as a communist country, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. And then in 1982, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was erected in Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Rohshan. Next up, major figures. So first off, we have Ho Chi Minh, and he is the leader of the North, and he led Vietnamese Communist Party in struggle for liberation from French and U.S. dominance, and to unify North and South Vietnam. Next up, I'm gonna butcher this. Nigel Diem. We're just gonna call him Diem. Leader of South Vietnam. He was from 1954 to 1963. He's supported by the United States, and he was assassinated in 1963. Next up, Lyndon Johnson. He promised to honor his predecessor John F. Kennedy's limited U.S. commitments in Vietnam, but he lied. He ended up escalating the war dramatically after the U.S. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 1964. Empowered by the resolution, Johnson authorized Operation Rolling Thunder in 1965 to bomb North Vietnam into submission. When this failed, he sent more than 500,000 troops to Vietnam and ultimately converted the conflict into a protracted and bitter war. Next up, we have the General Robert McNamara. Oh wait, no, sorry, U.S. Secretary of Defense. My fault. The U.S. Secretary of Defense during the battles in Vietnam. He was the U.S. Secretary of Defense during the battles in Vietnam. He was an architect for the Vietnam War and promptly resigned after the U.S. lost. We're going to continue this. So after McNamara resigned, Clark Clifford was the second Secretary of Defense. And basically, he just continued being Secretary of Defense. He wasn't that much of a figure, big figure. And lastly, we have Richard Nixon. He was the president at the time when the war ended, and it technically didn't end, they just ceased fire. And he also invented Vietnamization, which was a plan provided for a gradual phased withdrawal of American combat forces combined with an expanded effort to train and equip South Vietnam to take over military responsibilities for its own defense. He also ended the war in Vietnam. And so I was going to say the last one.
Lastly, we have William Westmoreland. This like I said, William Westmoreland, this general directed much of the U.S. military strategy during the Vietnam War. He gradually sent more soldiers to Vietnam, from 16,000 to more than 500,000.
Is this yours to do? The impact of the war on U.S. As Rohshan said in his other video, there was an anti-war movement that happened during the Vietnam War. Basically, a lot of colleges, it started off with colleges, were against the war, and it led to a lot of protests. And we're not going to talk about draft recusal.
Yeah. There was a lot of draft refusal during the war, as the Americans caught wind of like the bloody, terrible acts that the Army was committing in Vietnam. And just some numbers for the violation, there was 200,000 men who were accused of violating the draft laws. 360,000 were estimated to have violated the law but were never formally accused. 8,750 were convicted and 4,000 served jail time. And a pretty famous refusal that sparked a lot of other young people that refused the draft was that of Muhammad Ali of Cassius Clay. And in 1967, as the United States was in Vietnam, Ali refused to be inducted into the armed forces, saying, "I ain't got no quarrel with the Viet Cong." And then on June 20th of 1967, Ali was convicted of draft evasion, sentenced to 5 years in prison, fined $10,000, and banned from boxing for 3 years. but he stayed out of prison, and his case was appealed and returned to the ring later that year. And this was just this is a pretty famous video.
Ali defeated Foley by a knockout in the 7th round. Immediately thereafter, he walked into the teeth of a monumental decision. He was drafted, and then he refused induction on the grounds of his religious convictions on war.
My conscience won't let me go shoot my brother or some darker people or some poor hungry people in the mud for big powerful America and shoot them for what? They never called me nigger. They never lynched me. They never put no dogs on me. They never robbed me of my nationality, raped and killed my mother and father. Well, I'm going to shoot them for what? How am I going to shoot them? Them little poor little black people, little babies and children and women. How can I shoot them poor people? Just take me to jail.
While fighting imprisonment for his stand out,
That was just him explaining his decision to do the draft.
I don't think we have enough time for this video, so it was just an overview summary, so that's the end. Thank you.